Greetings and welcome. We are in Junior English, and our objective now for the hour is to spend time with one of the great classics of Puritan thought, early American thought. We are with John Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Now, I'm on page 87 of your hymnal, and there's several things I want to point out before we address this text. One, please see the word "from" at the top of page 87. In other words, you can go online and see the entirety of this sermon. You are only given a small part of this sermon. Okay, that's the first thing I would say. Two, there's any number of ways that we will address this text, all right, as we study it. One way, obviously, is to approach the theological significance of the text. What do I mean when I say that? The theological significance of the text. Anyone know what I mean when I say that? Theology, the study of theos. The Greek root theos is what? Does anyone know? Theos. Theology is the study of what? Does anyone know? Views of God. Views of God. So when we say theology, we are saying specifically, Jonathan Edwards has a certain view of God that we're going to talk about. Okay? Now, some of you will say about that view of God, clearly a different understanding of God 200 plus years later. We'll maybe ask why that is the case. A third way, though, a third point I want to make about this text is that we can study this text without really getting into a lot of the theological arguments, quite frankly. We can talk about this text as a work of rhetoric. R-H-E-T-O-R-I-C. More particularly, we can study this as a work of persuasion. Persuasion. Now, what do I mean when I use that term, persuasion? What does that term mean? You're trying to persuade someone. What are you trying to do? Convince them in some way. Okay? And when we look at this sermon, we're going to ask ourselves, how does John Edwards try to convince his audience? What are the primary techniques that he uses? And as we actually read this text together and parts of this text, we're going to actually write down in our notes, what are the techniques, the rhetorical techniques that he uses to try to convince his audience? The final comment I want to make, and this is historic in its significance. This sermon becomes one of the most successful sermons, and it is passed around in written form, and it is read over and over again from pulpits in church houses. And people will leave the church house going, yes, that was a great sermon. I kid you not. This sermon is exceptionally well received in the New England areas, in churches up and down the eastern seaboard. It's a very popular sermon. It's read and studied long after the fact. Well, let's take a look at this sermon, shall we? The introductory materials on 87. The famous sermon, of course, in Enfield, Connecticut, 1741. You'll want that in your notes. It could end up on the exam. Believe it or not, he did not scream the lines of this sermon. For those of you who are public speakers, this is fascinating. He let the language that he wrote deliver the power. He did not project his voice, apparently, the first time. Now, this obviously was read many times afterwards with all kinds of booming elocution, right? According to a single account, he read are you reading this with me? Geez, some of you would have liked not to go to church if this was the case. What does it say there? 6-hour sermon. So right away, so you can write something down. This tells you something about the people who go to church in 1741. That they would be willing to sit for that long and listen to the sermon. He read it in a level voice, staring over the heads of his audience at the bell rope that hung against the back wall, as if he would stare it in two. Despite his calm manner, his listeners are said to have screamed in terror, and Edwards had to stop several times to ask for silence. Now, right away, let's point out, this sermon is going to elicit a response from that audience which will maybe be a little different from modern audiences, or what we might even qualify as postmodern audiences. Having said that, though, what we want to focus on now is the rhetorical techniques that are going to be persuasive in their essence, what he wants people to understand and how he wants to persuade them. These are just some of the high, it's hard to know the correct adjective, high water marks of the sermon. Let's take a look. This is the case of every one of you that are out of Christ. That world of misery, that lake of burning brimstone is extended abroad under you. There is the dreadful pit of the glowing flames of the wrath of God. There is hell's wide gaping mouth open, and you have nothing to stand upon nor anything to take hold of. There is nothing between you and hell but the air. It's only the power and mere pleasure of God that holds you up. You probably are not sensible of this. You find you are kept out of hell, but do not see the hand of God in it. But look at other things as the good state of your bodily constitution, your care of your own life, and the means you use for your own preservation. But indeed these things are nothing. If God should withdraw his hand, they would avail no more to keep you from falling than the thin air to hold a person that is suspended in it. Your wickedness makes you, as it were, heavy as lead, and to tend downwards with great weight and pressure towards hell. And if God should let you go, you would immediately sink and swiftly descend and plunge into the bottomless gulf in your healthy constitution and your own care and prudence and best contrivance, and all your righteousness would have no more influence to uphold you and keep you out of hell than a spider's web would have to stop a fallen rock. I'll pause here for just a second and point out for your notes. Notice all of the provocative word pictures Jonathan Edwards uses. Notice here, you're so heavy with sin, falling towards hell, that your falling and being caught would be like a spider's web trying to catch you, impossible to accomplish. We want to pay attention to spiders. Jonathan Edwards was into spiders. He'll use them again in this little ditty of a sermon. We'll get back to it. Were it not for the sovereign pleasure of God, the earth would not bear you one moment. The world would spew you out. By the way, notice the ellipse. That's parts of the sermon that go on for ad infinitum, and then we come back here again. You can read the entire thing online if you so wish. The world would spew you out were it not for the sovereign hand of him who hath subjected it in hope. There are black clouds of God's wrath now hanging directly over your heads, full of the dreadful storm and big with thunder, and were it not for the restraining hand of God, it would immediately burst forth upon you. The sovereign pleasure of God for the present stays his rough wind, otherwise it would come with fury, and your destruction would come like a whirlwind, and you would be like the chaff of the summer threshing floor. The wrath of God is like the great waters that are dammed for the present. They increase more and more and rise higher and higher, till an outlet is given, and the longer the stream is stopped, the more rapid and mighty is its course when once it's let loose. It's true that judgment against your evil works has not been executed hitherto. The hoods of God's vengeance have been withheld, but your guilt in the meantime is constantly increasing, and you are every day treasuring up more wrath. The waters are constantly rising and waxing more and more mighty, and there is nothing but the mere pleasure of God that holds the waters back, that are unwilling to be stopped and press hard to go forward. If God should only withdraw his hand from the floodgate, it would immediately fly open, and the fiery floods of the fierceness and wrath of God would rush forth with inconceivable fury and would come upon you with omnipotent power. And if your strength were 10,000 times greater than it is, yea, 10,000 times greater than the strength of the stoutest, sturdiest devil in hell, it would be nothing to withstand or endure it. The bow of God's wrath is bent. These are very famous lines, probably the heart of the sermon now to come. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string, and justice bends the arrow at your heart and strains the bow, and it's nothing but the mere pleasure of God, that an angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment from being drunk with your blood. Thus all that you never passed under a great change of heart, by the mighty power of the Spirit of God upon your souls, all you that were never born again and made new creatures and raised from being dead in sin to a state of new and before altogether unexperienced light in life, are in the hands of an angry God. However, you may have reformed your life in many ways and may have had religious affections and may keep up a form of religion in your families and closets and in the house of God. It's nothing but His mere pleasure that keeps you from being this moment swallowed up in everlasting destruction. However unconvinced you may be of the truth of what you hear, by and by you will be fully convinced of it. Those that are gone from being in the like circumstance with you see that it was so with them. For destruction came suddenly upon most of them when they expected nothing of it. And while they were saying peace and safety, now they see that those things on which they depended for peace and safety were nothing but thin air and empty shadows. Pause for a moment and put in your notes, what is he trying to do to his audience? What would you say, Ermintrout? What's he trying to do? This is clearly persuasion by fear, isn't it? And what is at the heart of his fear? His promise of a future what? Whoa, what is it that he promises is coming? Hell. Hell. Sinners are in the hands of what kind of God? An angry God. He now is going to drive the point home with a word picture which has left more than a few postmodern readers just a little bit disturbed. Take a look at this one. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you. Now, some readers are shocked that Edwards would say God abhors you. What does the word abhor mean? You might write that word down. Mr. McAfee, do you know this word? What does abhor mean? If you abhor something, what does that mean? Like or dislike?
Means
extreme dislike. Extreme dislike. The strongest word imaginable for hate. God abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath burns. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He's of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. Whoa! What are his species, animal species that he likes to reference? We've already heard spiders twice with spiders and snakes. Jot down in your notes, why do you think he references spiders and snakes so much? Why that? What's up with spiders and snakes, Miss Costales? What do you make of that? Like, why those? Why not cute little yellow lab puppy dogs and little lambs bounding over meadows? Why spiders and snakes? We normally think of spiders and snakes as being what Costales calls awful, kind of disgusting, right? Nasty little critters. By the way, if you show up on the boat and there ain't no Walmart, spiders and snakes are a serious issue, right? A spider bite or a snake bite can do you in pretty quickly, right? So in other words, he's picked animals as well, species, forms, life forms, insects, animals, that are dangerous and therefore feared. The ellipsis allows him to go on for a long time with this tenor, and now back to it. O sinner, consider the fearful danger you're in. It's a great furnace of wrath, a wide and bottomless pit full of the fire of wrath, that you are held over in the hand of that God whose wrath is provoked and incensed as much against you as against many of the damned in hell. You hang by a slender thread with the flames of divine wrath flashing about it and ready every moment to singe it and burn it asunder. And you have no interest in any mediator and nothing to lay hold of to save yourself, nothing to keep off the flames of wrath, nothing of your own, nothing that you ever have done, nothing that you can do to induce God to spare you one moment. And on the Calvinist theology will go. When God beholds the ineffable extremity of your case and sees your torment to be so vastly disproportionate to your strength and sees how your poor soul is crushed and sinks down, as it were, into an infinite gloom, he will have no compassion upon you. He will not forbear the executions of his wrath, or in the least lighten his hand. There shall be no moderation or mercy, nor will God then at all stay his rough wind. He will have no regard to your welfare, nor be at all careful lest you should suffer too much in any other sense than only that you shall not suffer beyond what strict justice requires. Notice the word justice here by Edwards is used. God stands ready to pity you. Notice this is a little bit later in the sermon now as he begins to wind this project down. 6 hours of this, guys, he went on. God stands ready to pity you. This is a day of mercy. You may cry now with some encouragement of obtaining mercy, but once the day of mercy is past, your most lamentable and dolorous cries and shrieks will be in vain. You will be wholly lost and thrown away of God as to any regard to your welfare. God shall have no other use but to suffer misery. You shall be continued in being to no other end, for you shall be a vessel of wrath, fitted to destruction, and there will be no other use of this vessel but to be filled full of wrath. Thus it will be with you that are in an unconverted state, if you continue in it. The infinite might and majesty and terribleness of the omnipotent God shall be magnified upon you. In the ineffable strength of your torments, you shall be tormented in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And when you shall be in this state of suffering, the glorious inhabitants of heaven shall go forth and look on the awful spectacle, that they may see what the wrath and fierceness of the Almighty is. And when they have seen it, they will fall down and adore that great power and majesty. Let's just pause for a moment here. We're talking, of course, eschatology, and the idea is in the afterlife, you will be burning in hell while who is watching? Right, the elect, the saved, the angels are watching, and they're actually going to enjoy, as St. Augustine will have earlier said it, enjoy this torment of hell. It's kind of like, yay, this is fun, watch all these people get jacked. Well, on and on it goes. Let's pause now and make some observations about a text like this. First of all, let's point out, this is an intended text to persuade. But to persuade what? Jot down in your notes. What is it specifically he's trying to persuade these people to do? What? Persuade them. Kennedy, what? Persuade them to do what?
I don't know, to take action and, I don't know, sin less.
Sin less, Kennedy says. Why would you want to sin less given this text? What is the propedeutic, the instructional tool par excellence that Edwards will use? If you sin, what? Miss Dorn? Right, snap, crackle, pop, for you. That is to say, you are going to get seriously jacked in an afterlife hell. End of discussion. Period. How does he accomplish his rhetorical purpose? What is the primary means whereby he does this? Let me ask a couple of guiding questions. Do you have any sense in his sermon that he's unsure about his position? Gee, I don't really know for sure what happens after you die. I kind of think this might... No. How do you want to qualify it? What adjective would you like to use? He's very confident. He is extremely confident, right? He knows with absolute certainty, and he is drawing the picture. How does he draw that picture, would you say? Is it very clear? Yeah, Kennedy does one of these, like, yeah, pretty clear. This is, if you will, an eternity of torture chambers. Or like really bad Saw movies or something like that, where all kinds of nastiness happens over and over again. Why? Why are these people going to get jacked? Why? Well, he has interesting answers. One of the answers that he gives is justice. The word justice. I don't follow. Someone help me to understand how the notion of justice can in some ways be equated here. And we should jump to a 3A observation. In literature, this idea of trying to literally scare the hell out of someone, right, is a very old technique. One of the most famous is, of course, the great Italian poet. Do we know his name? Dante, and he wrote a famous poem called the Divine Comedy, of which the first part is called the Inferno, or Hell, where Dante draws very clear pictures as well of what the afterlife looks like. You think John Edwards knew anything about good old Dante writing in 13? Yeah, obviously, right? Edwards is calling heavily on this notion of what hell looks like, and it is not a pretty picture, a place where lots and lots of torture happens. In Dante's world, or text, hell has a sign over the door. It says, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." That's what it says above the door of hell. Abandon hope, anybody that wants to come through these. In other words, once you show up here, you have no more hope. It's done, over, and the rest of your experience is nothing more than quintessential hell. Seriously? I think it was an AP student who put that sign on above my door. For many, many years, that sign stayed above 303. Thanks very much. The other thing I should point out is that Dante has another sign above hell that says, God's love created this place. God's love created this place. And Edwards will play the same kind of game. The fact that some of you are giving me a look like, seriously? This is the compassionate, loving God to do this? We're coming back now to the word justice. In Edwards' view, God has a right to jack people. It is the just thing to do because God is God. Of course, there is some behavior modification going on at play here as well, right? We should point out that later on in the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, your psych classes will tell you that the behaviorist's model was to try to change behavior through certain kind of behavior modification activities, right? Clearly, Edwards is kind of hoping as well that there's some behavior modification. How do you account for the fact that the audience members loved this sermon? How do you account for that fact?
They don't want to say they didn't like it.
Could be just outright fear. To say you didn't agree or didn't like it means what about you?
Which?
Right? There you go. Down to the snap, crackle, pop, right? Okay. Now, let's point out a couple of interesting things. This sermon only works if, you might write that in your notes and then start filling it in. This sermon only works if what? I've had honor students that go, oh yeah, that's very true. This sermon only works for an audience. This sermon only works if and only if what? You, the audience member, what? Really believe. Right. This sermon only works if you really believe in what it is that he's selling. If you don't buy it, does it work anymore? By the way, notice how he already kind of plays that game. You may think you're safe, but you're not safe. But you kind of have to believe what he's saying for it to carry any weight. This notion of eschatological post-mortem punishment, hell of some kind. Does it work, do you think? Does it work? This idea of trying to scare people into proper moral behavior. Let me ask the question a couple of different ways. Does the threat of punishment in an afterlife of some kind, does it work as an inducement for morally appropriate behavior? Do you think? Does it actually work? In other words, I'm about to steal something from the Blairs. My hand is about to go out and take it when all of a sudden I remember the words of John Edwards, sinners in the hands of an angry God, and I go, I better not. I mean, that's a serious price to pay for a pack of gum. I'm going to end up frying for an eternity in hell fire. I better not. Do you think it still works today? Can you scare people into behaving morally appropriately? I have a colleague, I tell this story to my seniors, but and so you'll have to hear it again when I do Dante, but I have a colleague, and she says she can still remember it. when she was 6. And she went to the summer vacation Bible school, where they took all the little boys and little girls down into the basement of this church building. All of them were sitting down with their ready for their little snacks in a little bit. There was a TV VCR unit in the basement. And the person organizing this project came and stood in front of the little group of kiddos and said, "This is what happens if you're naughty, little boys and girls," and hit the play button. Somebody in that group was on the fire department and had a video of a person burning to death, rolling around, screaming.
Stop it!
My colleague says she remembers everything about this moment. The color of the carpet, the smell of the room, the color of the walls. She remembers everything in vivid detail about this moment. Years later, ironically, she went on to become an atheist and a theologian, ironically. But the question that's most intriguing about this is, do you think it works? This person remembered, almost 50 years later, could still remember that moment, call it up. So on one hand, you could argue, wow, did a pretty good job. Hodges says, even though she remembers it, you got a problem with this? Why?
She remembers it, but it didn't do what they wanted.
It didn't do what they wanted it to do. Jot down in your notes, why do you think you can't scare people into morally appropriate behavior of any kind? Why can't it work? Why will it not work? What do you think is the problem with that approach to educating people? Why does fear only work for a short period of time, Dorn? Why can't it work long term?
Because I think it scares them, but they don't really understand the importance of it.
Can scare them short term? Why can't fear work long term? Or can fear work long term? Or does fear only work for as long as you actually believe it or fear it? What do you think, Ms. Schroeffel? Can this work? You think that's a good idea? Scaring those little kids like that? No.
It's they're so little, they don't know what they believe in. They don't know what's going on. They're like, that person's burning, but that could be me, and I don't know what to do about it. And yeah.
Totally freaked my pal out. Totally freaked her out. Does it work to scare people into being morally appropriate?
I don't know, everybody has different morals. So I could be one of those people who go and steal stuff, and it'd be fine for me. But then Shelby doesn't like to steal stuff. It's bad. So she doesn't do that.
So how do you, without the threat of punishment, enforce a moral code? How do you do it?
Something good things are going to happen if you do it.
You promise them positive rewards. Bribery. But what about the people who don't care about that reward? Then what do you do? How do you make people do what they don't want to do without punishing them?
Incentives.
How do you do it?
Trick them.
Trick them. In what way trick them?
I don't know.
How do you do it? Are we stuck in an interesting conundrum? Jot down in your notes, the power of John Edwards' sermon has a lot to do with the inclusivity-exclusivity model, doesn't it? Notice, the people who believe they're not going to hell like this sermon a lot. Yes. All of you bad people need to hear this. Shame, shame, naughty, naughty. Right? There's a clear, identifiable kind of declension or mark, right? People who are in versus people who are out. Notice how it works rather nicely with our earlier comments on inclusivity, exclusivity. If you're part of the group, this is a great, great sermon. If you're outside of the group, the injunction, of course, is what? You better become part of the group and fast. Notice how this works for anyone standing outside of the group thinking dissent might be in her or his future. Of course, how do we take care of witches? Primarily, we do burn them. The fires that are going to represent the fires of hell, we get to see early. And guess what? People enjoy seeing the burning taking place. How do you account for that? Messed up? Do you think people still believe in this view of John Edwards today? Or do you think Americans by and large have moved beyond it? How many of you think people still believe this on some level? How do you account for that? Is it the power of religion? The power of fear. The idea that there could be some kind of long-term punishment racks the brain, worries the heart, etc., etc. It was interesting, a few years ago, an AP group went out randomly up and down the halls to ask 2 questions with their little clipboard. They wanted intel. They walk up to complete and total strangers at our school and ask 2 questions. Question 1, do you believe in hell where people go and get fried after they die? Question 2, do you believe you would go there if you died right now?
Wow.
Question 1, fascinating. Over 75% of Worland High School students responded to the first question with, yeah, I do believe. Yeah, I believe in hell. Question 2, do you think you would go there? Really, really low. No. Other people go there, not me. Interesting. My AP group had much to say about that, those findings, unscientific as they were. All right, well, thank you. There's an introduction to John Edwards.